Story 1. My son did something terrible on Halloween. I have a confession to make. I have been trying so hard to forget what I saw. But now that Halloween is right around the corner again, all these memories resurfaced all of a sudden. I now know it was wrong to keep my mouth shut. But before I tell my husband about it and later on the authorities, I want to get it off my chest anonymously. Maybe this will help me confessing to my loved ones. My son, I'll call him Al for the sake of this story, is crazy about Halloween. Each year he dresses up as a zombie. Al loves zombies. Last year he begged and pleaded with me to let him go trick-or-treating with his friends. I used to always come along, but that year he wanted to go without adult supervision. Just him and his buddies. He was 10 years old at the time and pretty mature already. I was reluctant at first, but after thinking it over for a while, I approved. We live in a friendly rural neighborhood bordering on large cornfields. Everyone knows everyone. I figured that they would be fine. The kid needed his freedom after all. Plus, his friend Amy would come along as well. She was 12 years old already and always reminded her younger friends to behave. However, one last glimpse of uncertainty within me caused me to decide that I would sneakily follow them to keep an eye on Al from a distance without bothering him, just to be absolutely safe. I did as planned, and on Hallows Eve, I let my son put on his costume and painted him some spooky zombie makeup, complete with sprinkles of fake blood on his ripped clothing and smears of it around his mouth. He took a look into the mirror and let out a squeal of delight. He hugged me, grabbed his little bag and rushed outside. I waited a bit before going outside myself. His father wasn't home that night, so I left a bowl of candy on the front porch in hopes of it not being raided immediately. Upon walking out the door, I saw Al run towards a small group of other kids in fancy costumes. I recognized them all. There was Amy in her witch costume. Our neighbor's son Mark was a vampire, and there was a ghost whom I could only assume was AL's best friend Blake. I smiled at the sweet sight. It was always the four of them. I followed them at a safe distance, trying not to catch their attention. I watched as they rang at the doors of several houses on their harvest, growing more and more cheerful the more candy they received. It was obvious that Amy wasn't too fond of AL's costume, though. From time to time, my son would scare her by jumping in front of her all of a sudden or making creepy sounds. Amy would shriek loudly every single time before bursting out into laughter. At some point along the way, they began developing AL's zombie scares into a full-on game of catch. My son merrily chasing around the others who, happily giggling, tried to avoid him. It was adorable to watch them play. I knew they weren't little anymore, but it still warmed my heart. They had reached the end of the main road and were still playing catch. They were enjoying themselves and I was content, until Amy suddenly ran off into the cornfield to the side of the road. Al, Mark, and Blake followed her, howling like little monsters along the way. I was taken aback. The cornfields were large and children, or rather residents of our neighborhood in general, were forbidden from entering it. Not because they would trample the corn, but because people had gotten lost in there before. I couldn't help but instantly get worried. I hurried to run after them, but seeing as I was in pretty bad shape, it took me a while to find them. When I finally caught up with them, I found that they had gathered at the side of the field. Amy was still chuckling but completely out of breath. "Give me a second, you guys," she panted. "Ah, come on," Blake argued from under his white cloak. "Playing zombie is so much fun," Al cheered. In the heat of the game, he had completely given up on his usual calm demeanor and was losing himself in a fit of giggles. "Can we keep playing zombie? Please." "Yeah, just give me a second, guys," Amy repeated. She was still bent over and trying to catch her breath. Suddenly, the three boys stuck their heads together and began murmuring something amongst themselves, out of earshot from Amy. What are you talking about?" the young girl asked. "We're playing zombie for real this time," my son exclaimed. I frowned in confusion, but stayed where I was. I watched as Blake and Mark strode towards Amy and grabbed her by the arms. It's okay. They're just trying to scare her again, I told myself. But that notion was quickly knocked out of me when Elle suddenly picked up a large stone from the dusty ground, his skinny arms struggling to lift the heavy thing. Slowly, at a pace almost menacing, he made his way over to Amy. I wanted to intervene. I wanted to dash out of my hiding spot and stop him, tear that rock put of his hands. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. Tears began welling up in my eyes and running down my cheeks as my mouth dropped open, trying to form sounds, to somehow produce the shriek I was hoping for, but to avail. I tried to move. I tried so hard, but I just couldn't. My body didn't obey me. I watched in horror as my son lifted the rock above his head and brought it down on the screaming, struggling girl's head. He did it again, then again, then again. My son, my child, my flesh and blood, bashed his friend's skull in. Blood was gushing everywhere, onto my son's hands, his face, his costume. Al let go of the stone and knelt down and fumbled around in the remains of Amy's head. I felt the vomit rise in my throat when I realized what he was doing. I remained paralyzed with fear, terror, and disgust as my son carefully picked at the bloodied, gory mess and slowly led bits of Amy's brains to his mouth. One by one, they vanished in between his lips like trick-or-treat candy. I didn't stay to watch Mark and Blake join him. When I finally regained control over my body, I simply turned and ran. I ran all the way back home, tears of shock still gushing out of my eyes. I barely made it into the bathroom before I started vomiting. When Al came home later that evening, I didn't come out to greet him. I wouldn't have dared to look into his eyes. I wouldn't have been able to. I haven't been able to look at him the same way ever since. I don't know why he did such a thing. Was it my fault? Where did I go wrong? How did my sweet little boy turn into a monster? I've pretended that everything was fine for almost a whole year now. Every time I would run into Mark's or Blake's parents on my way around town, every time I would pick up my son from school, I pretended I never saw what I saw. They found Amy's corpse the day after Halloween. The police never found out who had done it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be writing this right now. No suspects were ever arrested either. When they questioned my son, he lied through his teeth. Amy's parents moved away not long after. They couldn't stand being in that home in which they had made so many memories with their daughter. I know I should have told the police, and I hate myself for being too weak to do the right thing. I was scared of my own son, but at the same time scared of losing him too. I hate myself for not helping Amy. I don't know why I was unable to move, but had I been able to, if I could trade my life for hers, she would be standing here right now. I wish Halloween 2018 had never happened. It has left my son a killer, a sweet young girl dead, and me a guilt-stricken shell of my former self. I'm not stupid. I know that withholding information from the police in a case of child murder has severe legal consequences. I deserve everything that's coming to me, but so does he. I guess I thought telling the truth wouldn't make a difference. It wouldn't bring Amy back to life. But by now, I know that those were just the cowardly, foolish thoughts of a cowardly and foolish woman. I know it's way too late, but for once I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to use the blood-stained costume as evidence. I never disposed of it. They're going to figure out which stains are Amy's and which are fake blood, all right. I'm going to name Mark and Blake too. No more Halloween. No more playing zombie. Credit Girl from the Crypt. Story 2. The Last Halloween. I don't celebrate Halloween. When the trick-or-treaters come out and start prowling my street, I make sure to keep my front porch light off and pull the shades down. If someone rings my doorbell despite all my precautions, I hide in the bedroom and pray that they don't ring it again. There's always a fear that maybe it's not a child in a Ninja Turtle mask or wearing a sheet over their head. Maybe, just maybe, it's Granny Clark. Granny Clark is the reason I stopped celebrating Halloween. Abigail Clark, known to everyone in Hollisfield as Granny Clark, was the kindest, sweetest old lady in existence. She lived in a little green house at the top of Tamarack Lane, one that bordered a broad expanse of forest. She'd lived there as long as anyone could remember. Someone once told me she was over 100 years old, and nobody within earshot challenged the claim. I absolutely believed them. Juniper Street, the street I lived on, just happened to touch that same forest as Granny Clark's. There was a path that wound through the woods, all the way up the hill to her driveway. Many an afternoon was spent playing in those woods, climbing trees, building forts out of sticks, or running down that winding path from Granny Clark's driveway to the end of Juniper Street, pretending wolves were biting at my heels. I always felt somewhat unnerved being around Granny Clark. Maybe it was the way she walked, all hunched over, her arms bent at the elbows like a tyrannosaurus. Maybe it was her shock white hair that stuck out in all directions. Or maybe it was the way I could see her blood vessels clear as day through her translucent, liver-spotted skin, and the way her fingers seemed unnaturally long and thin. My mother took me to see her once when I was 7. They were coordinating together on an arts and crafts table at the local fair. I remember that her little greenhouse smelled like lavender and mothballs, and the rooms were lined with photos of children. Some of the photos were in black and white, or faded like they had been taken many years ago. "Are these all your kids?" I asked Granny Clark. She smiled and looked around the room. "These are all my lovely babies." Afterward, as my mother and I walked down the path to Juniper Street hand in hand, I told her how amazing I thought it was that one person could have so many children. She just laughed at me. "They aren't really her kids," she said. "Miss Clark doesn't have any children of her own. Those were photos of other people's kids." "Why does she have photos of other people's kids?" I asked. "Because their parents gave them to her." "Did you give her my photo?" "Not yet." I looked up at my mother with concern. "Please don't." She frowned, but said nothing the rest of the walk home. 5 years later, I got permission to go trick-or-treating with my friend Spencer on Halloween. Spencer lived over on Rosemond Avenue, a street which connected with a number of others, including Tamarack Lane. The neighborhoods over and around Rosemond were considered the best area for trick-or-treating in town, far superior to the neighborhood down around my neck of the woods. Together, we convinced both our parents that we were old enough to go on our own. What I didn't know at the time was that Spencer had other plans. When my dad dropped me off at Spencer's doorstep in my pirate costume, complete with eye patch, black marker goatee, and stuffed parrot velcroed to my shoulder, Spencer was already outside, sitting on the front stoop. He was going as either a zombie or an accident victim. I never really asked. His clothes were all torn and covered in stage blood, and he'd used some sort of wax to create open sores on his arms and face. I was genuinely impressed with the amount of work he'd put into making himself look grotesque. Once my father's car rolled out of sight, Spencer grabbed me by the arm and hauled me around the side of his house to the garage. "Listen," he said, "you have to help me pull something off. It better not be your pants." "Ha ha." He gave me a serious look. Josh dared me to prank old Granny Clark. Josh Gurry was a kid in our grade who Spencer had a habit of butting heads with. They'd had a rivalry ever since Spencer pinned Josh in under a minute during gym class wrestling. Since then, Josh always tried to make Spencer look weak in front of the other kids our age, and Spencer refused to ignore it whenever he did, probably as a matter of pride. Granny Clark? I didn't like the idea of doing anything to anyone, let alone an elderly person. Spencer saw the concern in my eye. "We're not going to do anything serious. What were you planning?" "It's simple," Spencer smiled. "You distract her by trick-or-treating at the front door. Just keep her talking. I'm gonna go in the back." "No way," I hissed. "I'm not going to be an accomplice to breaking and entering. It's not breaking in. She always leaves her back door unlocked." That seemed like an odd thing to know. "Anyway, I'll go in the back, sneak upstairs, and toilet paper her entire bedroom." As if to prove the legitimacy of his plan, Spencer pulled a large roll of bathroom tissue out of his trick-or-treat bag. "What will that prove to Josh? That you can TP some half-blind old lady's house? Are you going to help me or not? Because you can always walk home if you want." We stared at each other through our makeup effects for a few moments before I sighed and gave in. "But promise me we'll do a bit of trick-or-treating too," I said. "Otherwise my parents will know we were up to something." "Of course. I want candy too." "Geez." With that, we set out. Trying not to seem obvious, we meandered around the neighborhood for a half hour, letting the sun set and waiting for most of the other trick-or-treaters to finish going down Tamarack Lane, trying to reduce the chances of someone spotting us. I got some candy to get started on my alibi in case I was questioned later as to my involvement in scaring an old lady to death. My stomach was very unhappy with me and made it known by clenching up like a fist. I was hot in my pirate costume, but my whole body shook with anxiety. Finally, when the street lights had turned on and all the very small goblins and fairies were carted off back to their homes, Spencer nudged me in the ribs and nodded silently in the direction of the forest. I nodded back and we made a beeline for Tamarack Lane, trying to make small talk to continue looking inconspicuous. When we got to the end of Tamarack Lane, Spencer threw his arm out, stopping me in my tracks. We both stood, looking at the little greenhouse at the top of the hill. The front porch light was off. "Shit," Spencer hissed. "Welp, she's in bed. Abort mission." I started to turn when Spencer grabbed my arm. "Wait. I think I see her moving about in the kitchen." There was someone moving around in the kitchen. I couldn't make out who, just a silhouette pacing around in the back of the house, right near the door Spencer was planning to sneak in through. Spencer reached into his trick-or-treat bag, fumbling around for a minute before pulling something out and shoving it into my chest. "Here, take this." I took what he handed to me and looked down at it. "A walkie-talkie? Are you serious? Stick it in your candy bag. Then go ring the doorbell, and if you can't keep her busy, just reach in and click the button on the front twice. I'll hear it and bail." "Dude, the porch light is off." Spencer looked at me, and I saw the desperation in his eyes. He had to prove himself to Josh in this stupid, juvenile, ridiculous way, and if I didn't help him, he was probably going to do something even dumber. Or worse yet in his mind, go back to school and confess to Josh that he didn't do it. I sighed and dropped the walkie-talkie into my bag. "Just go and get it done quick. Granny Clark gives me the creeps." Spencer ducked down low and crept off into the trees and bushes by the side of the road. He was out of my sight in an instant, though I heard him shuffling around, snapping twigs and cursing as he stumbled through the dark. Once he was gone, I took a deep breath and looked up at the little green house. It seemed bigger and a darker shade of green than it had before, though I knew it was more my mind playing tricks on me than anything real. Through the window, the silhouette of Abigail, Granny Clark, shuffled about in her kitchen, occasionally disappearing out of sight around the corner, only to shuffle past in the opposite direction a moment later. I ascended the front porch steps, my right hand sliding into the candy bag to feel the walkie-talkie and make sure it was face up for easy access to the emergency button on the front. My pirate makeup was probably starting to run down my face due to the sudden sweat I'd built up on my forehead. The stuffed parrot on my shoulder felt like it was getting heavier. Somewhere, deep inside me, a little voice whispered, "I don't want to be here," over and over again. I felt certain I was going to hurl at any second. "Time to nut up or shut up," I whispered to nobody. I hesitated to push the doorbell button, trembling in fear, My finger hovered there in front of it for a solid minute. Then the walkie-talkie in my bag squawked once, loudly, and I clutched my chest as my heart lurched. Okay, I snarled quietly at Spencer through gritted teeth, knowing he was sending me a signal. I rang the doorbell. The sound of busy work inside the house stopped. I hadn't really been paying attention to the banging and thumping going on inside, but when silence settled over the house, I became horribly aware of the noises that had been going on as I approached. A sliding sound, followed by another thump, then a louder thump. Should I ring the bell again? I thought. Footsteps answered my question. Heavy, slow footsteps coming to the front door. The sound of their approach served to fill my tankard of dread even further. There was a hesitation in them, like Granny Clark wasn't sure what to do. Or maybe she was waiting to see if I'd leave. Please don't make me ring the bell again. The porch light came on and I froze. It was like being cast suddenly in a spotlight. There I was for all to see. Through the small, semicircular window in the door, I caught a brief glimpse of someone looking out to see who had rung the bell. I couldn't make out her eyes, just her eyebrows in the darkness. Then the door creaked open, and I was face to face with Abigail Clark. She looked haggard. Her eyes were sunken and hidden in shadow. Her features were even more pale than usual, and her whole face seemed to hang off her skull. She had pulled a shawl over her head, hiding most of her shock white hair. I could only see a few strands hanging down in her face. I swallowed the lump burning in my parched throat. I could barely squeak out the words, "Trick or treat." Granny Clark didn't say a word. She just stood there, not moving, staring at me with her dark eyes and that sickly-looking face. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement behind her, in the kitchen, and knew Spencer had entered the house. I needed to fill the silence or he'd be busted for sure. I coughed loudly, then blinked several times, trying to think of something to say. "Miss Clark," I stammered. "I'm sorry if I woke you." "Oh shit," I said, My mother insisted I stop by and say hello while I'm out trick-or-treating tonight, and I almost forgot. I knew she'd be disappointed if I went home and told her I hadn't paid you a visit. So I was hoping that despite your light being off, you'd... Granny Clark opened the door further, stepping halfway out onto the porch. As she did so, I noted the heavy brown coat she wore. I also noticed a pair of thick gloves on her hands. She seemed to straighten and turn, reaching behind the door jamb for what I assumed was a bowl of candy. Why you having trouble with the heat in your house, Miss Clark?" I could hear myself, and it sounded like I was going to cry. Why wasn't she speaking? One gloved hand beckoned me closer. Her breathing sounded labored and ragged, every exhalation gurgling like a diver using a snorkel. The expression on her face never changed. There was no sign of the joy or excitement I had seen every time I'd visited her in the past. She seemed like an entirely different woman, and I felt sensations of discomfort and fear battling each other in my gut. I stepped closer, holding my bag out, when a heavy thump came from the back of the house, followed quickly by a clatter of dishes shattering on the floor. Granny Clark and I both stiffened. Oh shit, I thought. Granny Clark turned her head in the direction of the kitchen, where Spencer seemed determined to make as much noise as he possibly could. It sounded like he had started having a seizure back there and was flopping around on the kitchen tiles, slapping everything in sight. Panic lurched out of the pit of my stomach. It felt like my eyes were going to bulge out of their sockets as I tried to think of anything to say to save the situation. My mind blanked, with the single word, "go," flashing like a neon sign in the center of my brain. Without another word, I turned away to make a hasty retreat. Granny Clark's heavily gloved hand clamped down around my wrist. For being over 100 years old, she had a grip like a lumberjack. She squeezed so tight that my legs turned to gelatin, dropping me to my knees. My goodie bag hit the ground with a loud clatter as I grabbed at her hand, crying out in pain. "Miss Clark, you're hurting me." Her other hand behind the door jamb appeared, holding not a bowl but a large box cutter. She extended the blade, looking at me with the same emotionless expression, and pulled me closer to her. The whole moment was so surreal that I just knelt there on the porch as she dragged me toward her, trying to understand what was happening. Why was she holding a box cutter? Where was the candy? What was going on? It was Spencer who saved me. His voice echoed, at once screaming distantly from the kitchen while also crackling over the airwaves and coming out of the bag at my feet. "Ruin!" Granny Clark turned again in the direction of the kitchen as she caught sight of Spencer dashing past, throwing open the back door and disappearing into the backyard. In so doing, her grip loosened on my wrist ever so slightly, just enough for me to twist my arm and squeeze through her fingers. She turned back to me, grasping at me with her free hand while the one holding the box cutter arched back threateningly. Even then, kneeling on the porch, watching the kindest old woman in town come at me, the blade of the box cutter glinting from the streetlights, I tried to rationalize the situation. This wasn't the Granny Clark I knew. I looked up at her, sobbing in panic and trying to find the words to calm her. "Please," I scrambled back a foot. "It was just a joke. I'm sorry." The left half of Granny Clark's face seemed to sag like it was melting. Her eye looked funny, droopy. The guttural breathing suddenly sounded more like a snarl, feral and angry. She brought the blade down, and I instinctively raised my hands to protect myself, screaming in pain as I felt its edge slice through the fabric of my costume and open the flesh of my arm. I did not give her a second chance. My legs that had initially surrendered to gravity now felt the intense burn of adrenaline pumping through them. Tucking into myself, I rolled backward, trying to gain my footing only to end up tumbling down the porch steps instead. White-hot pain shot up my left side, and I screamed again, but I refused to pause. I was too driven by blind panic. I got to my feet in a hurry as the old woman on the porch straightened up, towering over me like a giant. She tromped toward the steps with a frightening determination. Spencer, eyes wide with terror, came around the corner of the house at full tilt. He surveyed the scenario unfolding on the front porch, and a look of confusion washed over him for a second before he grabbed me by the arm and spun me around. "Make for the woods!" And with that, he was off like a shot, sprinting to the end of the driveway where the forest began. I ran, hot on his heels, my arm and my head both throbbing. Dizziness and nausea swept over me, and I tripped over my feet, colliding with the side of Granny Clark's car and pausing for the briefest of moments to vomit down the side of it. How had everything gone so wrong? Before I could collect my thoughts, I heard the heavy thud of boots and, looking back, saw Granny Clark's hulking form lurching toward me, silhouetted by street lamps in her heavy coat with the shawl over her head. She looked massive, like a lumbering horror, hell-bent on my destruction. Nobody's going to believe this. Even I don't believe it, and I'm seeing it, I thought. I shook it off and bolted for the tree line. I knew that, if I could just make it to Juniper Street, I'd be safe. The trail was a winding quarter-mile, but it was all downhill, and I had enough terror-based energy, pumping through my veins to keep me going. I'd run that path for years and knew every gnarled root that might trip me up, every change in the angle of the descent, every curve to avoid a tree in the dark. Just get home. The moon was out and it filtered through the branches, making beams in the dust kicked up by Spencer before me. It highlighted the path and cast the forest in a creepy blue hue. Everything around me seemed to glow. If I hadn't been running for my life, I might have stopped to take it in. The adrenaline coursing through me made time slow to a crawl. Every footfall felt like I was slogging through thick mud. I've never been as perfectly attuned to my senses as I was sprinting through the forest that Halloween. I could hear everything around me. My breath coming out slow and focused, my heart thumping in my ears, the snapping of branches further down the path as Spencer, less familiar with the way, ran ahead, and the heavy clumping of someone coming down the trail behind me. I turned to look. I did it knowing all the stories of people being told not to look back, and all the bad things that happened to them when they did. I did it not wanting to really see what it was because I knew. I did it, and all my hopes of making it home disappeared in a flurry of wings like a flock of startled pigeons. Granny Clark was right behind me, thundering down the trail like a rampaging elephant. She was a good 20 paces back, but I could see her perfectly in every sliver of moonlight we both ran through. The most frightening thing about her was the look on her face. It wasn't one of anger or even of determination. In fact, there was no expression whatsoever. Her eyes were dead. Her mouth seemed to hang open, the left half of her face still sloughed down like melting candle wax. And then the wind whipped her shawl off, and her face went with it. It just slid off as easily as a Halloween mask, disappearing somewhere on the trail behind her as she closed in on me, as determined and frightening as ever. Where her face had been, there was blood. Just blood everywhere, but I could finally see her eyes through it all, and they stared at me with a terrible rage and madness like I had never seen before. I thought I was going insane. She bore down on me, the sight of her hate-filled, bloody face burning forever into my mind. Her hands reached out, trying to grab me and guide me to hell, but all I could focus on was that scarlet face. The true fury within her finally revealed. There was a sharp turn in the path, and I slowed for only a fraction of a second to make it. Granny Clark was not as familiar with the trail, her momentum driving her straight on. Her fingers licked past the back of my head and wrapped around the stuffed parrot on my shoulder. She tore it off just as she barreled headlong into the trees behind me, crashing to a stop with violent abruptness. She can have the parrot, I thought. When I burst out of the woods and onto the tarmac of Juniper Street, I was moving like all of hell was on my heels. Ahead, I saw Spencer slowing down, trying to catch his breath as he reached the driveway to my house. Somewhere along the way, he had lost his own trick-or-treat bag, and most of his makeup had run off. "Don't stop!" I screamed at him. He turned, seeing me hurtling down the road, and hurried up to the front door, banging on it and shouting. I dashed up the front sidewalk, shoving him aside and throwing my shoulder into the door, having just enough sense to turn the knob and open it. We fell over each other on the landing, and Spencer kicked futilely, trying to close the door behind him. I climbed over him and slammed it shut before deadbolting it and leaning my full weight against it. I broke down into tears while clutching my arm. "Jesus Christ!" Spencer yelled. We both started shouting over each other, neither one listening to the other until my mom and dad, hearing the commotion, ran in from the living room to find us yelling and bloody. They looked us over with mild annoyance until my mom saw my shirt soaked red with blood and her eyes bugged out. "What the hell happened?" she yelled at us. I sobbed. My mind retraced through everything that I had just witnessed. Her face. They took her face. It came right off. Both my parents looked equal parts concerned and utterly perplexed. I could tell they thought we had just spooked ourselves and gotten hurt running away. I waved my hands at Spencer to silence him, then told them everything. As my story unfolded, their expressions wavered between doubt, anger, and concern. Honestly, telling them that Granny Clark attacked me with a knife and then chased me through the woods before her face peeled off, I had a hard time believing it myself. When I finished, Spencer told his side. When I went in through the back door, I could see Will and what I thought was Granny Clark at the front door. I tried to creep around to the stairs, but I tripped over a pair of legs. Miss Clark's legs. She was lying in the food pantry. I'd never seen Spencer cry before, but his eyes welled up with tears as he continued. Her face was missing. I could see all the stuff underneath. They had pulled it all right off, just like peeling an orange. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, they took her face. My mom disappeared into the kitchen, where I could hear her using the phone to call the police. My father stood there, shaking his head in disbelief at us. Spencer and I locked eyes. That wasn't her. Spencer's voice cracked. I realized it wasn't her on the porch, and I told you to run. I'm so sorry. I hugged him, forgetting the pain in my arm for a moment as he balled his fists up in my shirt and buried his face in my chest, adding his tears to the blood and sweat I was thoroughly soaked in. I'm so sorry. When the police got to Abigail Clark's house, they found her just as Spencer had described. Her throat had been slit, and all the flesh on her face had been removed. In the woods, they found the remains of her face, cut from ear to ear and worn like a mask. They also found my stuffed parrot lying in the leaves by a blood-covered tree at the turn that had saved me. One of the branches on the tree was snapped and dripping with the blood. Even more was found where the path opened out onto Juniper Street, but after that, the trail went cold. They found the killer a day later, an unemployed carpenter from 2 towns over with a history of violence. He checked into the hospital with a gouged-out eye, claiming he had accidentally impaled himself while hanging a picture. Apparently, his blood work came back with 2 different types on him, one of which was identified as Abigail Clark's. Thankfully, he confessed, saving the police from having to ask Spencer or I if we could identify him. Neither of us would have been able to, and neither of us wanted to ever see him again. I do see him, though, regularly. Whenever the scar on my arm flares up and my dreams turn to running down that moonlit trail in the woods with him just 10 steps behind me. Of course, the face I see isn't his. It's always Granny Clark's face, devoid of emotion, yet every step filled with anger, determined to catch me and put me in the ground. Granny Clark, the most beloved person Hollisfield has ever known, is the monster that haunts my worst nightmares. Credit: William Dalphin. Story: Halloween. When the masks come off. It has been a long time since I reveled in the fears of those I used to prey on. Could be said that I reformed from my old ways. Well, the old ways of my kind, not just my own. There was a time when I enjoyed the hunt even more than the meal, but I suppose I matured sometime over the centuries. Oh yes, I am ancient. Ancient to your perception of the word, anyway. To my kind, I am still quite young, and there are even far older things than us, I can promise you that. Humanity has barely scraped the surface of the mysteries this world truly holds, and mine are only slightly ahead of you in such knowledge, truth be told. There are many things that you got right about us, yet so many that you have gotten wrong. First and foremost, we are not attractive by your standards. To my people, I am a fairly average-looking individual, one who can easily blend into a crowd. I would find it significantly more difficult to blend in with your people, but it can be done. It does take focus, mind you. We are not shapeshifters, but we can influence how you see us. It was not easy at first, but I have grown quite talented in the act as I do enjoy walking in the human world when I can. Perhaps that is what led to my, shall we call it, rehabilitation. Oh yes, in my younger years, I would feast on you by the dozens without batting an eye. Over time, however, I think humankind began to grow on me. It was the children, I believe. Regardless of how sinister I may have appeared in your eyes, I would never feed on a child. Even when I saw you as little more than cattle, I could never end the life of an innocent. Perhaps I just never had the appetite for the taste of the pure of heart. It could be that the dregs of humanity have a more potent flavor. That being said, I will not pretend that I have never quenched my appetite on a harmless adult. Very few were off limits to me in my youth as I considered your kind beneath me. Though there are aspects of society that still disgust and confuse me, I no longer think of you all in such a manner. There are some, of course, but I no longer take the life of anyone unless I feel that they deserve it. There will always be filth to serve my needs, and I do enjoy the flavor. It has probably been some 300 years or so since I adjusted my outlook. I even took a human mate for a time. Her children were a delight to spend time with, even though they could see behind my illusion. Perhaps not the entirety of the real me, so to speak. Pure hearts can figure out the truth of things so much easier than the corrupt. Adulthood inherently brings with it a certain degree of corruption to even the most innocent of souls. It is just the nature of things, I would think. We see the world for what it is when we grow up, no longer just how we want it to be. I grew very fond of Abigail, my mortal companion, and her two little ones. I stayed with them for many years, but ultimately I would leave them before the years weaved their unfortunate spells on the frail, mortal shell. I think it was curiosity more than anything that led me to live in the mortal world for those years. I was fascinated by your ways, though I did not fully understand them. My people have little in the way of emotions, though we are not blank slates, as many would believe. I think we have many aspects that would appear quite foreign to you, aside from just the obvious physical appearance. We do not age in the same manner that you do. I suppose that can be taken for granted from the words I have spoken so far. We do have diseases and mental ailments, but they differ greatly from anything you could relate to. Another misconception about us is that we cannot transform your kind into ours. Our blood can carry pathogens that can lead mortals to crave that which we feed on, but it is more of a condition than an alteration. It frees the soul from the body, leaving only a walking shell. This remaining husk requires living sustenance to survive. My community has actually taken great offense to cults that have formed from such a disease. They would claim to be our equals, but they have no manner of understanding how far off they are in their assessment. Yes, should they continue to feed, they will live indefinitely. Surely they will be more impervious to bodily harm, along with the ability to heal certain wounds after suffering damage. It is still something more likened to donning a costume and playing a part than becoming anything like my kind. We can go without feeding for many years, should we choose. Unfortunately, this would render us with similar weaknesses to those of your kind, but it has been known to happen. We can even feast on the traditional delicacies of the mortal world should we choose, though we would reap little benefits from it. I must confess, I am quite fond of such things as your fried chicken and the occasional steak. Although I do like to walk amongst your people, the focus it takes to keep my appearance hidden requires a great deal of effort the longer I maintain it. This is why I have grown to thoroughly enjoy the festivities of All Hallows' Eve. It is the only time of the year that I can allow my true face to be observed and cause no more than a fleeting fright to those who may look upon it. It is a manner of freedom that my kind rarely gets to experience. I like walking the streets and enjoying the laughter of the children, though I find my eyes rolling at the sight of the older youths. The late teenage girls dressed in their skimpiest outfits regardless of how cold the outside air feels to them. The teenage boys wearing idiotic parody costumes that only serve to make fun of others. The smaller children show so much more class than the older ones. In recent years, there has grown an unsettling trend amongst some of the young people who attend a nearby university. They have proven to be quite the foul and useless examples of humanity who only enjoy bringing anguish to others. I have observed them from a distance over the months, in an attempt to understand their motivations. They call their actions practical jokes, and they even record them on their little devices that are rarely far from their grasp. They publish their clips on a variety of your internet pages, and I have observed others marvel at their works. I watch your world and attempt to understand your ways, but some things make very little sense to me. I must say, though, I have grown quite fond of your World Wide Web. Many of my peers mock my interest in your society, but most of them still cling to the old ways. They see you as little less than animals who have overtaken the land and forced us underground. I have attempted to convince them that we may still share the surface world, but they refuse to use our inherent abilities to blend in amongst you. They know all too well how mankind treats those they do not understand, and we have lost legions over the centuries to your fearful throngs. Those tales may lie in your books of fables and myths, but they show so much more clearly in our encyclopedias. Regardless of our shared history, I bear you no ill will. Were my kind greater in number, though, I imagine they would force all of you away from the light and into the caverns that we dwell within. There are so few of us left, and I believe it would be best if we could find a common ground after all these years. The group of miscreants I spoke of apparently grew tired of badgering their own peers and set their sights on the children of this city. As the Halloween season approached, I witnessed some of the youths in masks, leaping from trees to terrify young boys and girls who happened by. They succeeded in causing a little girl to cry while I watched on from the shadows one evening. She fell to the ground and tore a deep gash into the flesh of her little knee. She wept while a taller child, presumably her sibling, crouched beside her in an attempt to calm her down. The teenagers in the grotesque masks only laughed at the two of them and slapped their hands together, seemingly celebrating their defeat of such an innocent victim. I donned my most innocent and friendly face before making my way out of the darkness to greet them. I attempted to reason with the older youths and convince them that scaring little ones was no way to feel better about their own miserable lives. This only served to bring them more levity as they strolled away, reveling in their victory. I helped the crying little girl back to her feet and attempted to assist her brother in calming her down. Unfortunately, I only scared her more at first. She could see the shadow behind my veil, though just a hint of it. After a moment, she could sense that I meant her no harm, and she offered me a delightful smile for my efforts. She asked me what I was, an inquiry which caused her brother to study me more. He also saw beneath my mask, but he too did not flee in terror. I basked in their wonderful presence over the passage of mere moments in time as I escorted them back to their home, after a small stop-off at a nearby ice cream shop. It is truly magical to me that children can have the ability to see beneath the flesh. I know my appearance can tear into the bravest of men, but to a child, I am but a curiosity. Before I bid the two good night, they spoke of the variety of attacks these immature teenagers had been inflicting on others. It had become a tradition of theirs these past few Halloween seasons. The two children seemed to regain their fear of me for a moment when I bit into my thumb before their eyes. I had learned to control the toxins running through my veins over the centuries, so I would be able to repress any contagions should I choose. I allowed one single drip to fall from my fingertip into the little girl's open wound. She and her brother marveled at the sight of her gash closing shut, leaving no scar behind or any trace of damage to her flesh. She wrapped her tiny arms around my neck and rewarded me with a small peck of her lips on my scaled and hardened cheek. This caused a warmth to spread through my chest that I had not felt since I played in the fields with Abigail's son and daughter so many years before. I assured the two that the pranksters would learn the error of their ways very soon. I continued to observe the group of older teenagers over the following days. I watched from afar as they harassed so many more of the town's children. I watched on while the five of them laughed so much harder when they caused the little ones to fall to the ground. I felt a rage build from within me that I had not felt in decades. Though their actions angered me, I had no intention of bringing them any more than a simple fright. That was until they provoked a throng of small children to flee from their display, causing a few of them to slip and fall down a nearby hill. The two small boys and one little girl became silent when they made contact with the ground below. I leaped down after them, still hearing the laughter of their attackers from above. My bloodlust boiled over and I fought against the building urge to strike. I reached the trio on the lumpy ground at the base of the hill. All of them had gashes and cuts across their faces and limbs. The smaller boy had broken both of his legs, while the other boy and girl had suffered fractures of wrists and shins. Once more, I allowed droplets of my blood to fall into open wounds. Their small bodies contorted as they repaired themselves from within. Though the bones would heal, I had to assist in snapping them back into place before my blood fixed them at the unusual angles they lay in. Though the three were unconscious, they still winced and moaned from the pain I was forced to inflict upon them. This was only to help them, but I still felt a stab of guilt for causing them harm. The children would heal and remain unaware of my involvement, but this would not quench my thirst for vengeance. Perhaps I would return to the old ways one last time. The night of Halloween arrived, and the hateful teenagers spread their malice to any children who crossed their path. I followed close behind, having taken the form of vapor to remain unseen. Every fright they caused and every torment they provided only served to fuel my rage. I would stalk them through the night, but I would not strike until they were away from the children. I fought against my desire to shred their throats in front of the little ones, but my intent was not to traumatize the innocent. Still, their simple pranks may seem trivial to some, but to a child, they cut so much deeper. The pack of hooligans made their way into the woods. Perhaps they sought to find more prey behind the cover of the trees. Maybe they had their fill for the night and decided to talk the shorter route back to their dorm rooms. Their reasons made no matter to me. This would be where I would strike. They enjoyed bringing fear to the innocent, but I adored providing terror to the hateful. I followed behind, still in my misty form. I reached out to snap the occasional tree branch to revel in their alarmed glances behind them. All five were draped in tattered robes and rubbery masks. The tallest one pulled off his face, covering to reveal widened eyes when I snapped a long branch from a tree only feet behind them. As they quickened their pace, I knew my plan was proving fruitful. I spread my vaporous form as widely as I could to sever a circle of dry, rotted limbs around them. They all cascaded to the ground, landing in intermittent intervals after bouncing in and out of other branches on their descent. The quintuplets stopped and darted their heads around them in all directions. They spoke softly to each other as they turned around, seemingly intent on making their way back out of the forest. They moved quickly, but I moved faster. I scattered limbs before them and to their sides, causing them to travel the path that I desired. They would not be leaving this forest until I was finished with them. With my guidance, they buried themselves deeper into the dense woods until I was satisfied they were safely away from prying eyes. Now the bloodletting could begin. They had all pulled off their masks as the rubbery material had apparently restricted their flow of oxygen while their pace hastened. This was good. I wanted to see the expressions on their faces. I severed one last small and slender tree branch and sent it flying towards the tall one who was the first to remove his false face. He screamed in delicious agony when the jagged limb penetrated his left thigh. I made sure to avoid any arteries as I had not yet decided if they would be allowed to survive this encounter. The boy fell to his knees, gripping his hands tightly around his leaking wound. The other four ran to his side while darting their eyes across the darkened trees. I wanted so badly to make my appearance and introduce them all to a horror they could not fathom. But the moment had not arrived just yet. They still sought rational explanations for the broken slice of wood that sprouted from the oozing thigh. I split a variety of many sizes of limbs, causing them to shatter into splinters. I rained them down upon the five waiting victims like a storm that had erupted from above them. They all screamed in unison as thorn slivers buried into their flesh, bringing thin streams of crimson to leak slowly down their faces and arms. The thin strips were not strong enough to penetrate their extravagant clothing, but severe damage was not the purpose of this. Oh yes, they were afraid now. They screamed into the night as they gathered their friend from the forest floor. They all wore wounds now, but none were significant enough to cause any more than light scarring. They all fled in the same direction, and it was just about time for me to introduce myself. Though my body was gaseous at the moment, I could still feel the tingles of anticipation. It had been so long since I hunted for anything more than sustenance. I forgot how thrilling it could be. I shot ahead of them to prepare for my arrival. Turning myself to vapor did not allow my body to be clothed, as inorganic material could not be transformed. Somehow I thought my nudity would be just as unsettling to my prey as my scaled flesh. What would they notice first, I wondered? Would it be my yellowed eyes glowing in the moonlight? Perhaps my rows of jagged teeth behind the grayed flesh of my lips? The claws that tore through the skin of my elbows and knees? Or the twin spikes of my shoulders? It may even be the talons on the tips of my three-fingered and dual-thumbed hands that would catch their eye. I was enjoying this way more than I expected. I stood several yards in front of them when I made my body corporeal again. Transforming back to the flesh would always leave my skin slick and moist as though layered in sweat. I held my arms slightly outwards with my talons spread wide, keeping my head lowered so that my thick, dark hair would hang low on my face, revealing only the glow of my eyes through the strands. I even erected the fleshy wings from my veined and muscled back to allow my vast wingspan to prove that what they were seeing was far from human. I felt the ground beneath my feet vibrate as they skidded to a halt before me. Every one of them began to tremble, and a couple of them allowed their bowels and bladders to give in to the fear. Huddled together, they began to gradually back away, as if they thought I may not have noticed their arrival. I allowed my voice to devolve back into the guttural and wailing sounds of the golden age of my kind. "Do not turn away from me," I demanded, feeling my body shake with anticipation. "If you flee, you will never leave this forest again." Of course, they still attempted to run, but I would have hoped for no less. This is where the real fun begins. I chose to soar towards the two who ran together first. The long-haired boy kept his arm wrapped around the taller one, with the twig still protruding from his leg. I picked them both up with my taloned feet and raised them high above the trees. They screamed and writhed in my firmly grasping toes until I released my grip and allowed them the freedom they fought for. Their blood still dripped from my talons, which had pierced into the tender flesh of their shoulders. I briefly entertained the notion of letting them crash into bloody heaps on the firm ground below, but they would never learn their lesson through a terminal series of broken bones and twisted meat. I quickly descended towards them and regained my grip on the already shredded tissue I had grasped before. We were close to the forest floor when I caught them, but I slowed their approach before releasing them once more to shatter bones against the hard bark of the trees. They lay still and unconscious, but I could still hear their beating hearts. I retracted my wings and sprinted on all fours toward the three others who had escaped into the forest. I could smell their fear and feces, so they would not stay ahead of me for long. I leaped on top of the heavy boy with shaggy hair, snapping both of his shins as I pinned him to the ground. He spat as he screamed an assortment of curses, and I watched several strands of his hair turn pure white when I disjointed my jaw and allowed it to fall wide and open like the gaping maw of a hungry shark. The pure joy I felt in his terror was momentarily interrupted by my desire to bite out his throat and feel his spewing fluids spraying into my mouth. I fought the urge, as these foul individuals did not deserve a bloody death for their insults and pranks. They did, however, deserve to observe firsthand what fear truly looks like. I twisted my jaw back shut while the boy prayed on whatever god he found holy to allow his life to continue. I wrapped my hand around his face, allowing my talons to tear holes into his forehead and cheeks. I pounded his head into the ground until he lost consciousness, leaving a bloody reminder of what he saw this night. Only the pair who took the foreground on the prank against the little girl and her brother remained. The others had watched and laughed at their actions, but I saw this final couple to be the leaders of this band of hooligans. They always began the assaults and reveled most in the tears and injuries of the children. Their price would be the steepest to pay. Would I take limbs, perhaps? Leave them horrifically scarred and unfit for life among other humans? The options were many, but my time was short. Maybe we start small and see how it goes. Were my flesh capable of producing goosebumps, I imagine I would be sporting quite a few right now. I vaporized again to continue my pursuit in silence. I needed to get them together again. A nudge here and there should do the trick. I scattered more branches to guide their path. Once more. I even allowed parts of me to solidify to gently push them in the direction I wanted. The woods were quite dense in places, so I would lead them to a clearing. I would even allow them a moment to think they had eluded me. This was the most fun I'd had in centuries. As planned, the two found themselves in a wide-open area in the center of the forest, having the belief that they had arrived here of their own volition. I chose to observe from high above after they stopped running and caught their collective breath. They embraced each other and spoke of what they had seen. They spun theories of elaborate makeup and costume design while taking no time to inquire about the condition of their associates. It was as though they had completely slipped from their memory. They perched down beside the thin stream that ran through the clearing, washing their faces and drinking from the water in their cupped hands. The forest had fallen silent, as my presence often had that effect on the wildlife of such places. They sensed what I was and kept themselves hidden when my kind was nearby. Had these teenagers the same instincts, they may have been able to shield themselves from me. I softly allowed my gaseous form to descend to where the two sat side by side. The parting of the trees allowed the moonlight to illuminate the clearing and reflect in the water of the stream. I began to solidify once more, but remained silent behind my waiting prey. They sat by the stream, gazing into the night. If all went as I hoped, they would not notice me until their eyes met the reflective pool bearing my image behind them. I watched as their posture stiffened as, one by one, they felt the presence of something at their backs. I watched the water reveal their eyes gazing down upon it. They appeared too frightened to even move, which both delighted me and caused my heart to sink ever so slightly. My pursuit had come to a close, and this would be the final act of the night's festivities. The taller of the two slowly turned to face me. His eyes met my midsection, which paralleled his gaze. He turned his head gradually upwards to stare into my face. I wore a wide smile that bared each and every one of my razor-sharp teeth. Drool seeped from my mouth and dripped from my chin and onto my chest. It joined with my scaled flesh that was still moistened from my transition back to a solid form. I heaved with mimicked breath, as I did not need oxygen to fill my non-existent lungs. I wanted to appear feral and ravenous to the two cowering teenage boys who had brought such misery to the children of this small town. I looked on as they trembled in more visceral and blood-curdling terror than their little minds knew how to reckon with. I drank in their fear, and it nourished me more than any meal could ever hope to. Both of the boys faced me now. They adjusted their posture to prop upon their knees while they begged their gods to spare their worthless lives. I stretched one single arm out in front of me. They wailed and bargained with me to spare them, which only drove rage deeper into my ancient soul. With one single grasp, I snatched the quivering lumps of flesh before me from the ground on which they knelt. I gouged both of the taloned thumbs of my left hand into one of each of their eyes, and they screamed in agony and shock. I did not push my fingers deep enough to penetrate their fragile brain tissue, though I cannot say the thought did not cross my mind. My immense and powerful wings beat against the air of the clearing as I lifted them high above the treeline. The two writhed and wailed while I held them still outstretched before me. I watched the fear grip their remaining eyes as they begged harder than before for me to spare their worthless lives. For a moment, I found great temptation to feed on their fragile bodies, to bury my sharp teeth deep into their flesh and quench my thirst on the life force they still held within. A fresh meal was not the purpose of this endeavor, nor was ridding humanity of these trembling specimens. The deep gashes I clawed into their chests and midsections while we hovered above the forest below were only to allow them to always remember our meeting. They would never be able to read the words I carved into their skin. It was an ancient and long-forgotten language that only my kind would be able to decipher. Roughly translated, their flesh now bore variations of the words filth and free meal. I even sliced my name into them, like a painter autographing their work. I swiftly dropped back to the earth below and released the two above the rocks and pebbles that surrounded the stream. When they awoke, they could clean their wounds in the rippling water, but they would always bear the marks I branded them with. Their newfound lack of depth perception would also remind them never to revisit their old and immature ways. I stared at their twitching bodies next to the deceased and dried leaves of the woods. I felt proud of the deeds I had accomplished this night, and I rewarded myself with a snack, the two fresh eyeballs that still sat impaled on my taloned thumbs. I plucked them off and chewed them up, savoring the delicacy I had not enjoyed in many moons. The hour had grown late, but I still had time to stroll through the city streets and breathe in the remaining hours of my beloved Halloween. Tomorrow I would don my mask again, but tonight I would walk proudly among the people of this world. It has been almost a year since that night, and the 5 teenagers remain in one of your mental facilities. Of course, nobody believes the tale they spun of the terrors they experienced, but they do tell an interesting story. I still look in on them from time to time. I even allow them to see my face peering through the window when I feel like I could use a little levity. Their reactions are truly priceless. I still watch over the wonderful children of this small town, and their smiling, playful faces continue to remind me of why I gave up my ancient ways. Halloween is upon us again, and all I ask is that you remember this. Should you choose to prey on others this season, pay attention to those walking the streets beside you. Perhaps not all of the grotesque and monstrous faces you will look upon are made of latex and plastic. Maybe some of them are not as forgiving as I. Credit William Rain.